The Millionaire family lived in a huge house at the top of a hill, surrounded by tall trees and a shiny iron gate. The house was filled with sparkling chandeliers, polished floors, and rooms that seemed to go on forever. But despite the beauty and luxury, the atmosphere was always tense. The reason was simple: the twins. They were clever, lively, and full of energy, but no one could control them. Nannies came and went like the wind. Each one who tried to manage the twins lasted only a few weeks, sometimes just days. It was as if the children had a secret rule book that no adult could ever follow. Every morning started with chaos. The twins would wake up before anyone else, giggling and whispering about what trouble they could get into that day. They ran through the corridors like small storms, their laughter echoing off the walls. Breakfast was a challenge. The older nannies tried to get them to sit down and eat, but the twins would hide food in strange places, squabble over the last piece of toast, and spill juice on the polished floors. It seemed like no one could make them eat quietly or behave for even a few minutes. The parents were at their wits' end. They had tried everything: strict routines, rewards, punishments, even hiring tutors and specialists. But nothing worked. Every nanny left exhausted, sometimes in tears. The twins had a way of seeing through every plan, every trick, and every threat. They were unpredictable, clever, and stubborn. Friends and neighbors would whisper about the family's struggle, but the parents could only sigh and hope that the next person might succeed where others had failed. One rainy afternoon, a new candidate arrived at the house. She was not flashy, nor did she arrive with expensive recommendations or fancy titles. She wore simple clothes, a neat apron, and carried herself with quiet confidence. She introduced herself with a calm smile that made it clear she knew her work and believed in her abilities. The parents looked at her skeptically. "No one has lasted more than a few weeks," they said. "Do you think you can handle them?" The maid simply nodded, not with arrogance, but with a quiet assurance that made them pause. There was something different about her, something that suggested she might be able to do what others could not. On her first day, the maid walked through the house slowly, observing everything. She noticed the way the twins moved, the way they spoke to each other, and the tiny ways they tested everyone around them. She paid attention to the timing of their tantrums, the toys they fought over, and the spots in the house where mischief seemed to breed. While others had tried to force control with shouting or strict orders, she listened and watched. She seemed to understand that this was not about strict rules, but about patience, observation, and subtle guidance. The twins immediately noticed her. They looked at her with curiosity and suspicion. Most nannies had reacted with anger, frustration, or fear, but this new maid seemed different. She did not raise her voice, she did not chase them around the house, and she did not scold them at the first sign of trouble. Instead, she moved slowly, spoke softly, and sometimes even smiled at their little tricks. It was confusing for the twins. They paused, looked at each other, and whispered, "Who was this person who did not seem afraid of us?" The first test came quickly. The twins decided to hide all the spoons in the kitchen. Previous nannies would have panicked, scolded, or thrown up their hands in frustration. The maid, however, simply walked into the kitchen, crouched down, and began checking behind the cabinets, inside the oven, and under the table. She made a small joke about the spoon treasure hunt, which made the twins giggle. Then she calmly asked them if they wanted to help find them. To their surprise, they did. Slowly, they began to hand over the spoons, curious to see how the maid would react. She praised them for helping, not for obeying, but for their cooperation. It was a small victory, but in a household that had seen so many failures, it was huge. As days passed, the maid continued to observe and learn. She did not try to control the twins with force, but with understanding. She noticed what made them happy, what made them frustrated, and what captured their attention. She created small routines that were flexible and fun. Breakfast became a game where the twins could participate in simple challenges. Bedtime included stories that made them laugh and think. The maid found ways to redirect their energy without confrontation. Slowly, the house began to feel calmer, though it was still far from perfect. The parents were cautious but hopeful. They watched from a distance as the maid handled situations that would have ended in disaster with previous staff. They noticed that she did not raise her voice, did not punish harshly, and did not show anger when the twins acted out. Instead, she remained steady, patient, and focused. They could see the twins responding differently, showing curiosity, playfulness, and even moments of respect. For the first time in years, they felt a spark of relief. Even the household staff noticed the difference. They had grown used to the cycle of chaos where every new nanny seemed destined to fail. This maid did not fit the pattern. She moved calmly through the house, handled small crises with grace, and seemed to understand the twins' behavior in ways no one else did. The staff whispered to each other, impressed by her approach, though no one dared to say it aloud to the parents just yet. They waited, watching as the household slowly began to shift. The twins, of course, were not fully won over yet. They tested her in every way they could imagine. One morning, they filled the living room with water from the fish tank, giggling as the maid walked in. Instead of shouting or panicking, she calmly guided them to clean it up, making it into a challenge they could complete together. They were amazed at her patience and began to see that she was different from all the others. She did not get angry, she did not complain, and she did not punish them for fun. This realization puzzled them and slowly earned their cautious respect. Outside the house, people continued to whisper about the family's difficulties. But inside, a change was beginning. The maid was not a miracle worker overnight, nor was the house suddenly peaceful. But small victories were piling up, unnoticed by the wider world, yet monumental to those who lived them. The parents began to hope that this time, someone might succeed where so many had failed. And for the twins, someone had arrived who did not fear them, challenge them harshly, or try to overpower them. Instead, someone understood them in a way they had never experienced before. By the end of the first week, the house felt different. There were still messes, tantrums, and challenges, but the maid handled each with calmness and strategy. She did not try to dominate the twins, but guided them gently, with intelligence, patience, and care. She had not conquered the household, but she had begun to earn a foothold in a place where no one else had succeeded. It was a small step, but it was the first step toward something that had once seemed impossible: order, understanding, and perhaps even happiness in a home ruled by two mischievous twins. The parents watched quietly, amazed at the difference they saw. The twins, still full of energy and tricks, had begun to test boundaries in new ways, curiosity rather than defiance. The maid, moving quietly through the rooms, had shown that patience, observation, and respect could achieve what anger and frustration could not. She had not only survived her first week, but had begun to win the trust of the twins and the household staff alike. And in that house, filled with chaos, laughter, and occasional tears, a story was beginning that no one had thought possible, and no one would forget. The second week in the mansion began with the usual buzz of energy. The twins woke early, eyes sparkling with mischief, ready to take on the day. But something was different. The new maid, who had arrived quietly just a week ago, now moved around the house with a calmness that was almost contagious. She had learned the rhythm of the house, the exact moments when chaos would strike, and she seemed ready to face it all with a steady hand. The parents watched from a distance as the maid moved gracefully through the morning chaos. Breakfast, which used to be a battlefield, was now a carefully orchestrated dance. The twins still tried to hide pieces of toast and squabble over cereal, but the maid handled each move with patience. She would kneel beside them, whispering encouragement, or turn the search for a missing spoon into a game. It was almost like magic. For the first time, the parents felt a glimmer of hope that someone could actually manage the twins. The twins, naturally curious, were cautious. They watched the maid closely, waiting for a sign of weakness. They had tested every adult before, and most had failed spectacularly. But she did not react to their tricks in the way others had. When one of them squirted juice across the table, she calmly wiped it up and turned it into a lesson about cleaning together. She never shouted, never showed irritation. Instead, she showed control through her calm demeanor, and slowly the twins began to notice. There was a strength in her silence, a patience that challenged their usual rules of engagement. By mid-morning, the maid began to introduce small routines. She taught the twins simple songs that involved clapping and dancing while helping clean their toys. She encouraged them to take turns pouring their milk and stacking their dishes. It was fun, but it was also structured in a way that gave them small responsibilities. For the first time, the twins were participating willingly. They still giggled and tested boundaries, but there was a sense of cooperation that had never existed before. The parents could hardly believe their eyes. The house was beginning to feel like a home rather than a war zone. The maid also noticed the small frustrations that often triggered the twins' tantrums. One of them was sensitive to noise, and the other hated being interrupted when building something. Instead of forcing them to behave according to someone else's schedule, She adjusted her approach. She lowered her voice, softened the lighting, and allowed them to focus on what they were doing. The twins responded instantly, calming down and showing focus that no one had seen before. She had discovered that understanding their individual needs mattered more than strict discipline. It was a revelation for everyone, and slowly trust began to grow. Evenings were always a challenge, as the twins' energy seemed to double once the sun went down. But the maid approached bedtime with creativity. She created small rituals that made the twins excited to settle down. Stories became adventures where they could imagine themselves as heroes, and she would encourage their participation by asking questions and letting them act out parts of the tale. The twins began to look forward to these evenings. For the first time, bedtime was not a battle but a shared activity filled with laughter and imagination. The parents started to notice changes beyond just behavior. The twins began to talk more openly, sharing little thoughts and ideas that had been hidden behind mischief. They asked the maid questions, seeking her advice and guidance. They laughed with her, nodded her, and occasionally even followed her suggestions without hesitation. It was a subtle but profound shift, and the parents felt relief they had not experienced in years. However, not everything was smooth. The twins were still clever and mischievous, and they found ways to test limits. They would hide objects, play tricks on the staff, or create small messes to see how the maid would react. Each time she met their challenge with calmness and creativity. She would turn cleaning into a game, or redirect their energy into a constructive activity. Her approach was consistent, which confused the twins initially. They were used to adults reacting with frustration, fear, or anger. Here the reactions were steady, gentle, and intelligent. Slowly the twins realized that they could not push her into losing her temper, and that realization started to change their behavior. The household staff, too, were amazed. They had grown accustomed to the chaos and had learned to expect failure. Yet this new maid was different. She earned quiet admiration from the butler, the cook, and even the gardener. They whispered among themselves about her patience and skill, noting how she managed situations that would have overwhelmed anyone else. Even small victories, like getting the twins to dress themselves without argument, felt like monumental achievements in this household. It was as if someone had finally cracked the code. By the end of the week, the maid's approach became almost a routine. She would start the day observing the twins, noting their moods and planning small activities to channel their energy. She still faced challenges, but she met each one with a combination of patience, creativity, and subtle authority. The twins began to respond differently, testing less, cooperating more, and even showing affection in little ways. They would offer her a hug or show her a drawing without being asked. These were tiny gestures, but in this home they meant everything. The parents, once doubtful, now began to speak in whispers of admiration. They saw the change in their children, and even in the atmosphere of the house. The once tense corridors now felt lighter, filled with laughter that was not mischievous but joyful. They realized that the maid had not only managed the twins, but had begun to teach them lessons in patience, cooperation, and respect. It was a transformation that no one had dared to hope for, and yet it was unfolding before their eyes. Even outside the house, the neighborhood started to notice small differences. The twins were still lively, but they no longer ran wildly through the streets causing commotion. They greeted neighbors politely, listened to instructions, and sometimes even offered to help with small tasks. The maid's influence was subtle but powerful, changing not just the twins but the environment around them. People who had once whispered about the family's struggles now looked on with curiosity and admiration. The second week ended with a sense of quiet accomplishment. The maid had faced the initial skepticism, observed the household dynamics, and begun to implement her strategies successfully. The twins had started to recognize her as someone different, someone they could engage with rather than challenge endlessly. The parents felt a sense of relief and hope that had been missing for years, and the staff, who had seen countless failures, now looked at her with respect and a bit of wonder. While there were still challenges ahead, the second week had proven something vital. The maid was not just surviving in this demanding household. She was beginning to thrive. She had begun to build trust, earn respect, and influence the twins in ways that no one else had managed. The house was still filled with energy, mischief, and occasional chaos, but it was also filled with hope, laughter, and the promise of order. It was a new beginning, a small but important step toward transforming a household that had once seemed impossible to manage. The story of patience, skill, and understanding was just beginning, and it was clear that by the third week, the atmosphere in the mansion had begun to change in ways that surprised everyone. The maid was no longer just a new presence. She had become a calm anchor in a storm that had once seemed unstoppable. The twins were clever, mischievous, and full of energy. But now they faced someone who did not react with fear, anger, or frustration. Instead, she met their tricks with steady calm and gentle guidance, creating a sense of curiosity in the children that no one had seen before. The twins continued to test boundaries, as any child would, but now their tests were met with patience and clever solutions. One morning, they decided to take all the cushions from the living room and build a fort so tall that it nearly reached the ceiling. In the past, this would have been met with yelling or scolding, and the fort would have been torn down immediately. This time, the maid walked over calmly and examined their creation. She praised their effort and suggested adding soft blankets to make it a safe place to play. The twins' eyes lit up. They had expected punishment, but instead they were encouraged to channel their energy creatively. They spent the morning rearranging pillows, laughing, and carefully listening to her advice. It was a small victory, but it had a profound impact. Meanwhile, the parents watched from a distance, amazed at the transformation. The house, once filled with constant tension and fear of chaos, now had moments of laughter and order. The maid was quietly earning the twins' trust, not through strict rules or fear, but through understanding, patience, and clever guidance. The parents whispered to each other, feeling hope they hadn't felt in years. For the first time, they could imagine a household where their children could be happy, energetic, and well-behaved all at the same time. In the afternoons, the maid introduced small projects that captured the twins' attention. She encouraged them to help in the garden, teaching them how to plant flowers and water vegetables. She guided them in small cooking tasks, letting them measure ingredients and stir batter while explaining the steps. These activities were not chores but adventures, and the twins responded with focus and excitement. They began to understand that their energy could be used creatively rather than destructively. They started to look forward to these projects, asking questions and showing pride in their work. The household, once a place of tension, began to feel alive with purpose. Evening routines continued to improve. The maid had discovered the twins' love for stories and began creating tales that combined adventure, problem-solving, and humor. She encouraged the twins to act out parts of the story, making them active participants rather than passive listeners. They laughed, imagined, and engaged in ways that had been impossible before. Bedtime, which once involved tantrums and resistance, now became a time of connection and excitement. The twins began to request the stories, showing that trust and patience had begun to take root in their relationship with the maid. Despite these successes, challenges still arose. The twins were clever and mischievous, and they found ways to test the maid's patience. One day, they hid her cleaning supplies and pretended not to know where they were. Instead of scolding them, she turned it into a game, asking them to find the items together while giving hints and small clues. They laughed, cooperated, and felt a sense of accomplishment when the task was completed. The maid's approach showed them that collaboration could be fun and rewarding, teaching lessons in patience, problem-solving, and teamwork. The household staff continued to notice her influence. They had grown used to chaos, but now they saw small victories almost every day. The twins were more cooperative, more curious, and more willing to engage in structured activities. The maid's steady approach had created a ripple effect, changing not only the children but the environment of the house itself. The staff began to feel inspired by her methods, realizing that patience, observation, and understanding could achieve what force and frustration never could. The parents were quietly amazed. They saw the twins learning to manage their impulses, cooperate with each other, and show kindness in small ways. The maid's influence had begun to shape not only behavior but character. The twins were still full of energy and curiosity, but now they had a framework for understanding boundaries and consequences without fear or harsh punishment. It was a transformation that no one had thought possible, and yet it was unfolding before their eyes. One afternoon, a minor accident tested the maid's skill. The twins, in their excitement, spilled a large bowl of paint across the floor. In the past, such an event would have ended in yelling, tears, and frustration. This time, the maid approached calmly. She guided the twins to clean up the mess together, turning it into a creative lesson about responsibility and teamwork. They giggled, learned to work together, and were proud of the result. This moment, small as it seemed, reinforced the lessons of trust, patience, and cooperation that the maid had been teaching consistently. As the week went on, the twins' respect for the maid grew. They began to approach her for advice, ask for her help in solving small problems, and even share secrets they had never told anyone else. The maid listened, guided, and encouraged, always maintaining her calm authority. The relationship between the maid and the twins had evolved from cautious observation to mutual respect and affection. The parents noticed the change not only in behavior, but in the way the children interacted with each other and with the household staff. The energy that once felt uncontrollable now had direction and purpose. Outside the walls of the mansion, the world continued unaware of the transformation happening inside. Neighbors, friends, and acquaintances still whispered about the difficulty of managing the twins. But inside, a story of patience, intelligence, and compassion was unfolding. The maid had begun to achieve what no one else had managed, and the house had started to feel like a home, rather than a battlefield. The twins were still lively, full of energy, and occasionally mischievous, but now they were learning to channel their energy constructively and interact with others respectfully. The maid's influence extended beyond the twins. She quietly mentored the household staff, showing them ways to manage challenges with patience and creativity. The staff began to adopt her methods, creating a ripple effect that transformed the dynamics of the entire home. The house, once marked by tension and chaos, now had a rhythm, a sense of harmony, and an atmosphere that encouraged learning, creativity, and joy. By the end of the third week, a significant transformation had occurred. The maid had established herself as a calm, wise, and patient presence in the mansion. The twins, once unmanageable, had begun to respect and trust her. The parents, once filled with worry and doubt, now felt hope and admiration. The household staff, who had seen many failures, were inspired by her approach and eager to support her. Small victories, laughter, and cooperation were now part of the daily life in the mansion, marking the beginning of a profound and lasting change. The third week closed with a sense of quiet accomplishment. The maid had faced the twins' challenges, navigated their clever mischief, and continued to earn their trust and respect. The house, once filled with tension, was beginning to feel alive with connection, laughter, and purpose. Each day brought small victories, moments of learning, and a sense of hope that had been missing for years. The story of the maid's patience, intelligence, and understanding was unfolding beautifully, showing that even the most difficult challenges could be overcome with empathy, creativity, and unwavering dedication. The journey was far from over, but the foundation for a lasting transformation had been firmly laid. By the fourth week, the mansion felt completely different. The maid's presence had become central to the rhythm of the household. The twins, once uncontrollable and full of wild energy, were learning to manage themselves in ways no previous nanny had achieved. They still had bursts of mischief, of course, but those bursts were now met with guidance, laughter, and creativity rather than frustration and scolding. The house had begun to feel warm and lively, instead of tense and chaotic. Mornings had become a kind of dance. The twins still woke early, but now they greeted the maid with playful enthusiasm rather than defiance. Breakfast had transformed from a battleground into a cooperative activity. The maid encouraged the twins to help pour juice, set the table, and prepare simple meals. She praised small successes, celebrated teamwork, and created little games to keep their energy directed and focused. The twins laughed and competed playfully, but in ways that promoted cooperation rather than chaos. The parents watched from a distance, quietly amazed at the transformation. They had almost forgotten what a calm, joyful morning felt like in their home. During the day, the maid continued to introduce structured activities that engaged the twins' curiosity and intelligence. She organized small science experiments, art projects, and gardening lessons. Each activity was designed to teach patience, problem-solving, and collaboration, while allowing the twins to channel their energy in creative ways. They eagerly participated, asking questions and exploring new ideas. The maid guided them carefully, offering gentle encouragement and praise rather than criticism. She treated their curiosity as a gift, not a challenge, and the twins responded with excitement and respect. the twins also began to interact differently with each other. They still teased and played tricks, but under the maid's guidance, they learned to share, take turns, and help each other. When disagreements arose, she calmly guided them through problem-solving rather than imposing solutions. Slowly, they began to understand the value of cooperation and empathy. Their bond with each other strengthened, and the household became more harmonious as a result. Evenings were a time of connection and reflection. The maid created small routines that the twins looked forward to: bedtime stories, songs, and creative play. She encouraged them to express themselves and think critically about the stories, asking questions and letting them act out parts of the tales. These moments became opportunities for learning, laughter, and bonding. The twins began to trust her guidance and share their thoughts and feelings openly. The parents noticed the change in their children's behavior and emotions. The twins were more confident, curious, and respectful. They had begun to develop a sense of responsibility and self-awareness that had been missing before. Of course, challenges still arose. The twins were clever and unpredictable, and they found ways to test limits. One day, they decided to hide the maid's cleaning supplies and pretend they didn't know where they were. In the past, this would have ended with shouting or frustration. This time, the maid calmly turned it into a game, guiding the twins to find the items while giving hints and small clues. They laughed and cooperated, learning about problem-solving and teamwork. The lesson was subtle but effective. Actions have consequences, but guidance and collaboration make even mistakes productive and fun. The household staff continued to notice the maid's influence. They were inspired by her patience, creativity, and intelligence. Her approach changed not only the twins but the atmosphere of the entire home. The staff adopted her methods, handling challenges with calmness and problem-solving rather than frustration. The mansion, once a place of chaos and tension, was now a hub of learning, creativity, and joy. Even the parents, who had long struggled with disappointment and doubt, felt relief and admiration for the maid's skill and dedication. Outside the house, the twins' transformation became evident as well. Neighbors and friends noticed that they were more polite, cooperative, and engaged in constructive activities. They still had energy and curiosity, but it was now channeled into learning, play, and problem-solving. The maid's influence was subtle but powerful, shaping not only the twins' behavior but their character and approach to challenges. The world around the mansion began to see that change was possible, even in situations that had seemed impossible. One afternoon, a more complex challenge tested the maid's skill. The twins had accidentally mixed different paints together, creating a large, colorful mess on the floor. In the past, this would have triggered frustration and anger. This time, the maid approached calmly, turning the situation into a creative lesson. She guided the twins to explore the new colors, experiment with mixing, and eventually clean up the space together. The twins giggled, learned to work together, and felt pride in their accomplishment. It was a small victory, but it reinforced the lessons of patience, collaboration, and creativity that the maid had been teaching consistently. The twins' trust in the maid continued to grow. They sought her advice, shared their thoughts, and occasionally confided secrets they had never told anyone else. The maid listened attentively, offered guidance, and encouraged them to think critically and act responsibly. The relationship between the maid and the twins evolved into one of mutual respect and affection. The parents, who had once worried about the impossibility of managing their children, now observed with awe as their children flourished under her care. The maid's influence extended beyond the twins and staff. She had begun to shape the household into a place of order, learning, and connection. Small victories accumulated, creating a ripple effect that transformed the environment of the mansion. The house, once dominated by tension and chaos, now had a rhythm, a sense of harmony, and a welcoming atmosphere. Each day brought laughter, learning, and small triumphs, reinforcing the maid's influence and the twins' progress. By the end of the 4th week, the transformation was clear. The maid had become the central figure in the household, guiding the twins with patience, creativity, and intelligence. The twins were learning cooperation, responsibility, and self-awareness. The parents were relieved and inspired, witnessing the progress they had long hoped for. The staff, once accustomed to failure and chaos, now followed her example, creating a more harmonious and supportive environment. The mansion, once a place of tension and struggle, had become a home filled with learning, laughter, and hope. The 4th week closed with a sense of accomplishment and anticipation. The maid had faced challenges, navigated the twins' cleverness and mischief, and continued to earn their trust and respect. The household was thriving in ways that had seemed impossible just weeks before. Small victories, laughter, and cooperation were now integral parts of daily life. The story of patience, understanding, and skill was unfolding beautifully, demonstrating that even the most difficult situations could be transformed with empathy, creativity, and unwavering dedication. The journey was far from over, but the foundation for lasting change had been firmly established, and the household had begun to flourish in ways no one had imagined. Maid had the power to change everything. By the 5th week, the mansion had transformed completely. The maid, once the newcomer, had become the heart of the household. The twins, who had once been impossible to manage, now thrived under her care. Their energy, cleverness, and curiosity were still there, but it was now channeled in ways that promoted learning, cooperation, and joy rather than chaos. The house was filled with laughter, creativity, and purpose, and the parents finally felt a sense of peace that had eluded them for years. Mornings began with excitement rather than dread. The twins would greet the maid with playful enthusiasm, eager to start the day's activities. Breakfast had become a routine that involved cooperation and creativity. The twins would help set the table, pour drinks, and even prepare simple snacks, turning the meal into a shared experience rather than a battle. The maid encouraged small successes, praised teamwork, and transformed challenges into games that made participation fun. The parents watched from a distance, astonished at the change. They could hardly remember the chaos and stress that had once filled these mornings. Throughout the day, the twins engaged in structured activities that balanced learning and play. The maid introduced small experiments, art projects, and gardening lessons, guiding the twins carefully while allowing them freedom to explore and express themselves. They asked questions, solved problems, and displayed creativity in ways that had been impossible just weeks ago. The maid treated their curiosity as a strength, guiding them gently without imposing strict control. Each day brought new opportunities for growth, and the twins responded with enthusiasm and respect. Their bond with each other deepened as well. While they still teased and played tricks, they learned to cooperate, take turns, and help one another. Disagreements became opportunities for problem-solving rather than arguments, and they began to understand the importance of empathy and teamwork. The maid guided them through conflicts with patience and gentle advice, helping them see the consequences of their actions and the value of collaboration. Slowly, the twins became not just better behaved but more thoughtful and considerate of each other. Evening routines became treasured moments. The maid created stories, songs, and imaginative games that engaged the twins fully. They acted out parts of the stories, answered questions, and shared their ideas freely. Bedtime, which had once been a struggle, was now a time of connection and bonding. The twins looked forward to these moments, and the parents noticed their growing confidence and emotional maturity. They shared laughter, curiosity, and affection in ways that had seemed impossible before. The maid had created a space where learning, play, and love could coexist seamlessly. Challenges still arose, of course. The twins were clever and unpredictable, and they occasionally tested limits. One day they hid the maid's art supplies and pretended not to know where they were. In the past, such behavior would have led to frustration or punishment. Instead, the maid turned it into a cooperative game, guiding them to find the items with hints and encouragement. They laughed, solved the problem together, and felt pride in their accomplishment. This approach reinforced lessons in responsibility, teamwork, and problem-solving, showing that challenges could be opportunities for growth rather than sources of stress. The household staff continued to be inspired by the maid's methods. They learned from her patience, creativity, and understanding, adopting her approach in their own interactions with the twins. The environment of the mansion had shifted from tension and fear to collaboration, learning, and joy. Even the parents, who had once felt helpless, now observed with admiration as their children flourished under the maid's care. Small victories and moments of connection had accumulated into a profound transformation that affected everyone in the household. One afternoon, a particularly tricky situation tested the maid's skill. The twins had accidentally spilled a large batch of flour across the kitchen floor while trying to bake cookies. In previous experiences, such an incident would have ended in frustration and shouting. This time, the maid calmly guided the twins through cleaning it up. turning it into a lesson about responsibility and teamwork. She showed them how to use brooms, dustpans, and cloths effectively, making the task engaging and manageable. The twins laughed, worked together, and learned a valuable lesson about consequences and collaboration. The moment, seemingly small, was another step in solidifying the maid's influence and the twins' growth. As the week progressed, the twins' trust in the maid became unshakable. They sought her advice, shared their thoughts, and sometimes confided secrets they had never shared before. The maid listened patiently, guided them with wisdom, and encouraged them to act thoughtfully and responsibly. The relationship between the twins and the maid had evolved from cautious observation to deep trust and mutual respect. The parents, who had once despaired at the idea of managing their children, now felt hope, pride, and gratitude. Their household had become a place of harmony, learning, and happiness. The maid's influence extended beyond the twins and staff. The entire household environment was transformed. The mansion, once a place of chaos and tension, had become a space of order, creativity, and connection. The laughter of the twins, once a source of stress, was now a joyful presence. The staff, inspired by the maid, worked collaboratively, supporting each other and the children. The parents experienced relief, seeing their children develop emotionally, socially, and intellectually in ways they had long hoped for. The household had become a home filled with warmth, learning, and purpose. By the end of the 5th week, the transformation was complete. The twins, once considered impossible to manage, had developed a sense of responsibility, cooperation, and empathy. They were still energetic and playful, but their energy was now guided and constructive. The maid had earned their trust, respect, and affection, creating a bond that would last beyond her daily duties. The parents were amazed and grateful, witnessing the remarkable growth of their children and the harmony within their household. Even the staff, once accustomed to chaos, felt inspired and fulfilled. The mansion, which had once been a place of tension, unpredictability, and frustration, was now filled with learning, laughter, and connection. The maid had achieved what many thought impossible. She had not only managed the twins, but had transformed the entire household. Her patience, understanding, and intelligence had created a lasting impact. The twins' behavior, the staff's approach, and the parents' peace of mind all reflected the profound influence she had on their lives. In the quiet moments, the maid reflected on her journey. She had faced challenges, navigated mischief, and remained consistent and patient. Her efforts had changed lives, creating trust, respect, and affection where there had once been chaos and despair. The twins, who had once tested every adult, now looked up to her as a guide and friend. The parents, who had once felt hopeless, now admired her skill and dedication. And the household, once a place of stress and struggle, had become a home filled with laughter, learning, and love.